Welcome to IGCSE Computer Science Past Question Tutorial. In this particular video, we are going to look at a question from May-June 2025 2-1, and the question number is question number 11. So here is the question, and if you're watching this video, I would advise that you have this question handy. You can actually download it and follow through while I explain. Now, this is the question. The one-dimensional array competitor name contains the names of 25 competitors in a tournament that includes 5 events. So we need to take note of the fact that we have 5 events included, and we also dealing with 25 competitors. All right. Another two-dimensional array, which is competitor score, contains the points scored by each competitor in the 5 events. The first dimension of this array contains the index of the competitor from competitor name, and the second dimension contains their scores. Each competitor receives a score out of 100 so for each event. So these scores are manually entered into competitor score. So medals are awarded to the competitor or the competitors who have the highest points scored in each of the 5 events. The highest total points scored for all events, all 5 events. The one-dimensional array points stores the number of points scored for each competitor. Write a program that meets the following requirements. Takes an input, and of course this input should be validated to range from 0 to 100 inclusive. Calculates the highest points scored for each event and outputs the names of the competitors who receive a medal for the highest points scored. Calculates the highest total points scored for the 5 events. Outputs the names of the competitor with the highest total points scored for the 5 events. So, and you take note of this, you don't have to declare an array. So we'll be making use of pseudocode in this case, and we are going to ensure that all our inputs are giving appropriate prompts or messages. So, without any further ado, I will get to walking you through this question one step at a time. Let's go. So, before we start off this question, solving this question, I want to highlight a few points. The competitor name contains the names of 25 competitors in a tournament that includes 5 events. So the user doesn't have to enter these names, they are already stored in the array. In that case, we assume that the 1D array has some name values already stored. The competitor score contains the points scored by each competitor in the 5 events. So note that the competitor score is a 2D array, meaning that it allows us to store scores of each competitor across 5 events. And of course, we have the points array. So the points array stores the total points of all the events for each competitor. So let's go to step number 2. We are going to declare an array, which is highest points array, to store the highest points for each event. So in that case, I have given you a sketch here for the highest points array. So what this means is that the highest points array for the first event is going to store all these events at this point. Is going to store all the events for event 1. So it's going to store the highest point here. And the event 2, the highest points will be stored here, and so on up to event 5. Step 3 is to initialize the highest points and the points arrays. So we want to ensure that we assign zeros to all those points. That is our step 3, to assign zeros to all those points. So technically, we are going to have a 0 assigned to all the points like that. So we also going to do the same for the points array. So in that case, we are going to have zeros all through for points array. So but how do we do this? First of all, we move for index 1 to 5 because the highest points array is of the dimension 5, meaning that it contains 5 values. So we want to move from the very first element all the way to the 5th element. We are going to assign 0. And of course, that is why you see zeros assigned. The next, we assign in the same way 0 to the points array. And assigning to points array means that since there are 25 points, then we are going to assign 25 zeros to each of the blocks of our array. So having taken note of that, we move straight away to step number 4, which is to validate and store scores. And of course, you know that our valid scores range between 0 and 1 inclusive. So we start, first of all, by moving row-wise. We have 25 rows. So we are starting from the first row and moving to the 25th row. So for each row, we are going to move 5 times, that is across the columns. Because if we move for this row, how many columns are we going to move in order to store? We are going to move 5 columns. So that's actually what we do here. So moving 5 columns, I want to use repeat until to validate input to range between 0 and 1 and 100 inclusive. So that is what I have actually done using the repeat loop here. So at this point, my value is validated, having used repeat until to validate. Then I'm going to store the value in the actual block. So the array that stores this is competitor score, and competitor score for whatever row that is the current index, and for that column where we are moving, it will be stored in there. So at this point, this tutorial is simply to walk you through this because I believe that by now you must have been aware of what this particular line of code does. So this simply means, for instance, if we are moving for row 1, it means that for row 1, we have to go for all the columns, that's 5 columns. So say for instance, we move row 1 and we are in the current our current column is 1, so it means row 1 column 1. So what will that be? It is going to be this point. So if we move row 1 column 2, it's going to be at this block, so a value should be stored there, and this value must have been validated using repeat until. So this is how we move and until we exhaust the entire indices of the array. So having done that, we move to step 5, which is simply to compute and store competitor's total score for each event. Now, just be observant. I have highlighted each step accordingly. Now at this point, what I'm going to do is that because our points, all the blocks in our points array have initial values of 0. So if we are moving, for instance, the very first point, what we are going to do is that we are going to take whatever points that exist at that row. Say row 1 is point 0, of course. So we are going to add to the 0 whatever our score is. So this score is already validated. So we add a score to it, and of course it gets updated accordingly. Then we move on to the next step. The next step is step 6, which is to compute and store the highest point scored in each of the 5 events. So how are we going to do this? Now we focus our attention again on this highlighted portion. Now notice that this highlighted portion is within the innermost loop, which is the loop that takes care of the columns. So the column-wise movement, this is the loop that we are still on. So we are going to make a comparison for us to compute the highest point for each event. So we take it that if the score is greater than the highest points, right, then we are going to store that particular score as the highest points. So technically we update the highest points at this point. So say for instance we move again to our table where I had to show you this. Now for instance, each time a value is entered in this particular index, what we do is that we are going to compare the value with what already exists here, which is at this point 0. So say for instance our score here is 50, and we now compare 50 with 0. Of course 50 is greater than 0, then this will now change to 50. So technically that's what this means. So without much wasting of time, we can move to the next step, which is step 7. At this point, we calculate the highest total points scored for the 5 events. So for us to calculate the highest points scored for the 5 events, we initialize this variable max point to 0. So this is going to help us to store the highest points, the maximum points scored. So what does this max point, what is it going to track? It is going to track the maximum points, right? It's going to track these points to check which one is the maximum, right? So it's going to track this to check which points is the maximum. It could be multiple rows, it could be a single row. The point is that it's just a single value that will at the end become the maximum point. So that's what we actually tracking at this point here. Having initialized, we move on to actually catch it. But take note of the position of this initialization is outside all the loops outside the very first loop or the outermost loop you have to initialize. Then we move on within the outermost loop just immediately after the innermost loop. So this is the innermost loop. So immediately after the innermost loop, then we are going to perform our calculation because we want to catch it row wise. So each row we catch, not column wise. If we were planning to do that column wise, it would have been within the innermost loop. So because the innermost loop captures the column wise kind of data or logic. So at this point, we perform our comparison. We pick the points at the current row and compare it with the max point. So max point initially was 0. So we could say whatever the points at this row is, maybe row 1, the points could be 50, it could be 20, whatever. So whatever it is it greater than what the max point is? If it is, then it means that the max point has to be updated with the value of that point at that row. So that's actually what that means. So moving on to step 8 is simply to start displaying the names of the competitors who receive a medal for the highest points scored for each event. So how do we do this? We just start a new loop, and we don't have to concentrate on using the loop we established earlier. So we have to use exclusively a different kind of loop, which will be independent of the previous loop we've been using. So for competitor in this case means the index that tracks the rows of the competitors. You could name yours anything, but I just want to give it a meaningful name or a meaningful identifier. So for competitor 1 to 25, also look at the event. The event simply means the index of the 5 events ranging from 1 to 5. So we need to display the names of the competitors with the highest points for each event. The highest point is already stored in the highest points array, and this highest points array has 5 values. So, and each particular value corresponds to an event. Say event 1 will now have highest point at index 1. So in that case, highest points shares the same index with the events, or better still, the various or the 5 events. Yeah. So now we check whether competitor score for that particular competitor for a given event is the same as the highest points for that particular event. So if it is, then we have to display the name of the competitor using this. Right? Remember that competitor name here is not a 2D array, it is simply a one-dimensional array, and that's why you see this index competitor and not like this one, because this is a 2D array, meaning that for each row there exists like multiple columns. That's it. So this is simply showing us a column that has, many just kind of top down kind of data arrangement. So we move to step 9, which is to display the names of the competitors with the highest total points scored for the 5 events. So what we do here is, in the same vein, we are going to establish we are going to use a for loop But this time we are not going to make use of nested loop. We want to use two loops whereby one encloses the other. So because we are looking at, displaying the competitors that have the highest total points scored for the first events. So what we do here is that we want to move from competitor 1 all the way to competitor 25. For each move, we want to check whether the points, recall that the points array stores the total points for each competitor. So we check what the competitor's point is. If it is the same as what we have taken note of as the max point, then of course it means that this competitor scored the maximum point recorded, and we have to display the name of that competitor. So that's what we do here. And of course, at this point, I believe that we are all good to go, and these are working perfectly well. Here is the complete code. We started off by declaring an array to store the highest points for each event. Using declare as a keyword, then the identifier for the array, an array as a keyword, the dimension, which means from index 1 to index 5, and the data type is real. So this simply means that we are starting from index 1 and we are stopping at index 5. You could start from index 0, but you may have to end at index 4. Second, we initialize all the elements of highest points array to 0. And third, we initialize all the elements of points array to 0 in the same manner. So having done that, the next step is that we are going to initialize max point to 0. And that is what we have achieved here at this point. And here we move on to validate and enter competitors' scores. So how do we validate? Recall that we are entering scores in a two-dimensional array to start with. So that means we are going to make use of nested loops. So the first loop is targeting the row, and there are 25 rows. And the second loop is targeting the columns, and there are 5 columns. So we move for each column. For us to enter the data, we need to ensure that the data we are entering is valid, meaning that it has to be a value between 0 and 100 inclusive. Now, my instruction stipulates me to make use of appropriate messages, which I have used here to inform the users of the kind of message to expect. Right. So, and the condition is that the score must be greater than or equal to 0 and also less than or equal to 100. The next, I'm going to store a valid score for each event. So it means that the loop has taken care of the valid score, and away from the loop means I'm going to store the score that has been validated. So we move on to compute and store competitors' total points, and the total points will be stored in the competitors in the points array. So we store the total points in the points array by updating. So it means that for each particular score entered, I'm going to check whether I'm going to actually add it to whatever that is already stored in the points array, and of course store same in the points array. So the points array is going to hold those total points for each competitor. So remember that there are 5 points for each competitors. So each of those points correspond to the 5 events as described earlier. So I'm going to compute and store the highest points for each event. How do we do this? We'll check if the score is greater than the highest points, and recall that the highest points is a one-dimensional array which stores 5 values. So we store accordingly like this. Last, we are going to calculate the highest total points scored for the 5 events. And in the same manner, we move on to work around this like this. And we move to output all the various names as follows using this array. And finally, we output the names of competitors with the highest total points. So this is a repetition of what I had mentioned earlier. And if this video is interesting to you, make sure to subscribe and share if you haven't done so already. There are a whole lot of people that might also be needing this kind of intervention. Thank you and see you some other time.